check this. This is the hard knock life, but not the chicka kind. More like the people in the world seeking perspectives with a different line. The kids who share their interests together with a similar kind. When they said Don Glover for Spider-Man, they didn't mind. The activists, directors, comments and the lectures, fanboys, professional artists.
Welcome back to another episode of Hard NOC Life. I am your obedient servant, K.Chow, and we are talking about something a little bit different than what we usually do on Hard NOC Life. Normally, we cover everything from superheroes to science fiction to comic books, but this time around, we're going to be doing it a little differently. We're going to be talking about a Broadway musical, and if you know me, if you know some of the writers on our site, it's the only Broadway musical that matters. That's right, we're talking about Hamilton, and to do so, we're going to do it a little differently. We're going to have actually some more guests appearing in the later segment of the show. Hollywood reporter-writer Rebecca Sun, as well as Broadway Black managing editor and creator of the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite, April Rain. But until then, our first guest today is someone near and dear to my heart and is the reason that I am Hamilton obsessive. You know her from her writing on Black Girl Nerds and EW, as well as recapping Arrow for us at the Nerds of Color. Please welcome back to the Hard NOC Life, none other than Constance Gibbs.
How you doing?
Welcome back to Hard NOC Life. You are, as I said, you are the reason that I am all about Hamilton. So give the viewers and listeners a little primer on how you became obsessed with this musical.
I've been following Lin for a while now, just because we actually went to the same high school, and not at the same time, but he was a substitute teacher one year. I didn't have him, but it was like the year before he did In the Heights. So nice. He was around the school. People sort of like saw him, and he was like the attractive sub. So like people, like teenage girls knew who he was. And then In the Heights came out, and so it was sort of like alumni pride and stuff. So I've been following his career since then. Basically, I got to see an off-Broadway version of In the Heights. And then I actually, probably a few months or a few weeks after the 2009 White House performance where he did Alexander Hamilton for Michelle and Barack Obama, I saw that and I was like, I'm ready for whatever it is. So when it finally came to off-Broadway and then Broadway, I was just like, okay, how do I figure out how to see this? And I started trying to put it out of my mind for a while, just because like, I don't have Broadway money. But then the soundtrack came out and I was upset, like, listen to it every single day for at least 7 months. Like, I still listen to it almost every day. It's one of my alarms, but it's I've learned how to listen to other music finally. I think
anyone who's on the internet, anyone who has any kind of inkling about popular culture, you knew about Hamilton. I mean, I like you, I didn't have the high school connection, so little humble brag there, Connie, but I was aware of the White House performance, right? And like most people, kind of like this is kind of hilarious, and then whoa, this is kind of dope, actually.
Right.
I kind of heard rumblings about that there's going to be a musical about the founding fathers with like people of color. It was like, oh, that's an interesting take. And it wasn't until, and I think I heard, like I said, I'd heard rumblings about it, but it wasn't until I can trace it back to two things, my like Hamilton obsession. And the first thing was you are the reason. And this is what I'm telling everyone. It's Connie is the reason. And this is because, as I said, Connie writes Arrow recaps for the Nerds of Color. And back in, I think, October, this was after the soundtrack had dropped, she did a recap about I think it's the episode Lexi Alexander directed, which was a pretty like big deal for us since Lexi is a fan and a friend of the show. We were really excited to write about her episode on Arrow. The brilliant thing Connie did, because, if you know Connie, if you follow Connie on Twitter, she likes to drop Hamilton references and everything.
All the time. Yeah, all the time. Mm-hmm.
So your Arrow recap, you basically subtitled it "The Room Where It Happens," and you made multiple references to how the episode lined up with the song. And I might have streamed like a song here or there on NPR or whatever, but I didn't listen to it like obsessively. But I had the brilliant idea when I was editing your piece that, I'm gonna, every time you mention a lyric, I'm gonna link to that exact point in the lyric, and it's gonna be awesome. And so that actually led me down my first rabbit hole when I listened to The Room Where It Happens like 1,000 times editing your piece, and that led me to other songs. But I still hadn't become an obsessive yet. I downloaded the album, but only listened to it on shuffle, which is a weird thing to do. If anyone's ever listened to the soundtrack, it flows as one complete narrative so well that it's weird to listen to it in like shuffle.
Oh yeah.
So I started, but it would have occasionally come on in the car, and my daughter became obsessed with the Schuyler sisters, and then so she started listening to like a few of the songs like over and over and over again. And then I was on a drive. I was on a pretty long drive after that happened when I started like, you know, I could feel Hamilton creeping up some more in me. And I did a drive where I listened to the whole thing finally for the first time, because I never had the opportunity to listen to the whole thing, right?
Right. Yeah. A lot of people say that it takes like they need to section out at least 2.5 hours to listen to it. And in our busy lives, a lot of people don't have that.
Exactly, right? So like I would listen to like here and there, but this was the first, I had a long drive, so I threw it in and listened to the whole thing. And I remembered like I was like in hour 2 of my drive, and like I started crying as I'm driving. I'm like, I gotta pull over. Why am I crying? This is weird. Like Philip dies. Oh, spoiler. We're gonna spoil stuff from Hamilton. Like when Philip dies,
Yeah.
I'm like bawling in the car and I'm like pulling over.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the point where I was like, okay, I'm all in. This has affected me in such a way that I get the internet now. I understand the internet. I'd seen all these references, seen all these memes, and I was like, what is up with all that? You know, I watched the Ham for Ham stuff, and then
Right.
Like, I was done. I became one of your disciples, Connie.
Yes, the Gospel of Lin.
You're one of the few people who's actually been in the room where it happens. I know, like, I'm one of those Hamilton obsessives who obsesses over the soundtrack, because I've never, I don't live in New York. I don't, like you, I don't have Broadway money. And even if I did, I don't have Hamilton Broadway money. One, you've seen the play.
Right.
How did you manage that?
So one of the actors in the show, the guy who plays Hercules Mulligan, he did a show at a theater that I work at. So some of the crew members, he saw them, you stand at the back of the orchestra, and it costs $40. So the cast has access to that, because even for them, it's hard to get their friends into the show in like actual seats unless you're like Oprah or someone like super famous. So he was just like, oh, to them, do you want to come one day, hit me up? And then because they know that I'm obsessed with it, they were like, you want us to try and throw you in there? And I'm like, is that a question? What's happening? Why are you asking me this? So, you know, they got me in. And so it's really funny to do standing room, just because it's at the back of the orchestra. Can't really see what's happening on the top of the balcony unless you kind of go like this. So the entire row of people, whenever anything was happening on the back, too much stuff. But see Angelica's skirt. Angelica's up there, great. But it was just really fun. And the thing about standing room for this kind of show is that you would think that you would get tired and it would be, you know, sort of like, oh, I have to stand for 2.5 hours. But so a couple days later, I looked at my phone and I forgot that I always forget I have the health app and that it tracks my steps. It said that I'd done the equivalent of 9 flights of stairs on that Thursday that I went. And I was like, oh, it's because I went to Hamilton and I was bouncing and like dancing and like jumping around the entire show.
Wow.
So it was easy to forget that I was really standing, because I was like having so much fun actually like being in the room.
In the room where it happens.
All the performers were there except for Philippa Sue. So she had her stand-in that day, but all the other performers were there. So it was just really great to see Lin and see Leslie. Like Leslie's just so amazing in person. As is David. I think those are probably my two like in-person like I was like blown away, especially David, because he has so much energy and you can hear it on the soundtrack, but like seeing him like bounce around the stage was mind-blowing. They're just obviously always fantastic. And Renee Goldsberry, she sounds even better than the recording, like every single time. I don't understand. She's amazing.
You know how whenever like the president or like celebrities go see Hamilton, there's always the Lin-Manuel selfie that happens afterwards, and you are one of the very few people to also get the Lin selfie. Can you describe that?
So like I said, someone that we knew, some of my friends knew, had tickets, got us to see the show. And so they were like, do you want to come backstage? Again, is that a question?
Do you
Why
know
are
me?
you asking me this? the answer is always going to be yes. So we got to go backstage, like skipping the stage door line. I think everyone was sort of like, who are these people? Why do they get to go backstage? On the way up the little stairs that goes towards the stage, David was just like hanging out there, and he like smiled at me and I smiled back, and I was just like, oh my goodness, it was David. But I couldn't I didn't process to maybe we should take a picture. So I missed out on that opportunity, but I got to stand on a Broadway stage, which was just amazing in and of itself, just watching all of the seats ahead. And then my friend knew someone else, someone in crew, and they were like, could you get Lin to take a photo? And he was just like, sure, why not? Okay. And so he grabbed him over. It was their bowling night. So they had these Hamilton bowling shirts. So they were all very excited. So he came over and he took a picture. And I actually stole this idea from a fellow classmate of mine who also went to the same high school, Hunter College High School. He got to also do the same thing. He got to meet Lin and take a photo. But he was wearing a shirt from our high school. And nice. So I was like, I am going to steal that idea. Shame, no shame. So I did that. And so I was wearing my high school shirt, and so he was like, oh, Hunter. I was like, yeah, I went there. And so we sort of had a mini conversation about how he was the sub there and I didn't have him and I was sad about it. But he was really nice, and he took the picture, and then he ran over, because he has so much energy. He ran over to take a big group shot with all their bowling shirts and stuff.
Before Hamilton, were you a big were you into musical theater, or is Hamilton you're in, or how what's your history with musical theater?
I mean, there are a few soundtracks that I listen to. Some of them Broadway, some of them movie Broadway. So the movie soundtrack for Rent and the movie soundtrack for Chicago. But I'm not I just haven't had the opportunity to see a lot of the shows. So I've resisted listening to a lot of the music for them. So, everyone sort of knows the song from Wicked, but I haven't listened to any of the other songs because I haven't seen the show. So I would, want to see it first. And that's something I've experienced a lot with Hamilton, is that I have a lot of musical theater friends, though, because I worked in a theater and just have a lot of musical theater friends. And a lot of them who haven't been able to see the show yet are like, no, I want to wait to listen to the soundtrack to see the show, after I see the show. And I'm like, I get it, but this isn't the show you have to do that with. And so it's, it's sort of a mixture of I would love for someone to not have listened to the soundtrack and go see the show and actually just sit there and watch them. Are you having fun yet? What's your favorite part?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that sets Hamilton apart from other musicals, and I'm not the most versed on every musical. Like you, I have my share of soundtracks that I've listened to, and I've seen a few shows. I've never seen any show actually on Broadway, but I've seen a few, when they tour and stuff. And it also helps that my daughter is she's super into musical theater. She does musical theater camp. Yeah, she's the reason I'm more into musical theater now than I ever was before. It's because she comes home and she's singing Defying Gravity. I'm like, okay, let's find Wicked on YouTube or whatever.
Right.
But with Hamilton, one of the things that I've noticed at least is that it almost feels like you're listening to an audiobook, right? Because all of the dialogue is essentially on the soundtrack, right?
Right.
I mean, having not seen it, I feel like listening to it from Alexander Hamilton all the way through to Who Tells Your Story. It's I get the whole experience without the visuals.
Yeah, I think the things that struck me the most, that were sort of the most, you get, like you said, you get the whole experience. There's only one scene that's not on the soundtrack that's in the show. And it happens before Nonstop, so before end of Act 2. And it's not really a full song or anything. It's just a sort of a scene with dialogue with music to it. So it's not really pure dialogue, but it's also not pure a whole song or anything. So it's just one song that is not on there, and then everything else is the show. But the thing that struck me the most, when you listen to the soundtrack for months on end and you follow Lin on Twitter and all the cast members and things like that, you sort of get a visual in your head of how it goes, especially when you get beautiful books like the Hamilton that have beautiful photos in it, to sort of visualize it in your head a little bit. But the thing that struck me the most was the lighting. There's such amazing lighting that you don't get to experience obviously on the soundtrack. So I feel that was the thing that sort of hit me the most, wow, there are some awesome lighting choices here, which is just, I don't know, a random thing for my brain to think about.
Oh, no, no,
you get the whole show.
Yeah, that's part of the show, right? Things that I've heard when I've read reviews of the show itself or talked to people who've actually been in the Richard Rodgers is that some of the kinetic energy on stage you don't get necessarily just listening to it on CD, right? So that in Satisfied, for example, when it rewinds, that's apparently really awesome to see in person, that
Right. Yeah.
how they actually rewind the, the scene. So I get that. I totally understand that lack of, the visuals and the energy, which makes the show as well. Because part of that too, there's all this talk about it being this hip hop kind of R&B take on American history, but it also flips everything by casting people of color in all of the key roles except, King George and
Right.
Samuel Seasbury. But like that's something you don't necessarily get just listening to it. That's something the power of seeing that visual. That said, and I wonder, as someone who's seen 99% of the original cast do it, one of the things that I feel that separates this from a lot of Broadway musicals is that there's such a connection to the original cast that I wonder, like, because it's going on tour soon,
Right.
and it's going to have different casts, like any Broadway show that's going to cycle in and out. I wonder what it's going to be like to see someone not Daveed Diggs play Thomas Jefferson in Lafayette.
Right. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting because there are certain roles that it'll be really hard to see with different people. I feel like the two strongest would be Daveed and Leslie. I think other people, and they obviously have not seen the show and they've had stand-ins and things like that. I feel like for me, those are the two where I'm like, no one else can play this. Even Lin himself, like, Javier Munoz plays Hamilton once a week, every single week. So we're sort of used to the idea of him not always playing Hamilton.
Right.
So I don't know, because it is especially because we've been listening to the original Broadway soundtrack with their specific voices. So even sometimes going to see the show, it's just like, you did something different. And you can, like, we all know, like, when they mess up or when they riff differently. Chris Jackson at the end of One Last Time riffed so crazily. I like literally shouted, "Who are you?" Because how does his voice do that? So, there's still like little things, even good things when they change it up, where because we know the soundtrack so intimately, it's just like, you did that differently. And I know because I've listened to this 15 times today.
Right. And going back to Daveed, like, and again, if anyone's read the Hamilton, I also have it. Like some of my favorite lines in his songs in particular turned out to be like ad libs, right? Like, so there's a line in What Did I Miss when he plays Jefferson, and Madison says, "Where have you been?" And Jefferson says, France.
France?
It's like, and then I found out in the annotation that like Daveed just kind of like made that up. It's like, that's the kind of character that like these, and again, I don't want to judge other Broadway musicals. I mean, I'm sure there was something magical of seeing like Kristen Chenoweth and Idina Menzel, originate Wicked, but that the something like you said about particularly Leslie Odom and Daveed Diggs and for me as well, the scholars like Philippa and Renee too. Maybe because I've listened to those songs so often that I can't picture other voices doing those songs. That it's, and it's not, I guess it's not fair to future cast, because one of the things about musicals that make them everlasting is when they become more than the original cast. But I don't know, there's definitely a devotion to these particular actors that I think is stronger than other musicals. Like the Hamilton exists in the era of the meme, and I don't think other musicals have had memes generated. Right?
Yeah, not this strongly. I actually know the girl who does Hamilton Squad, so she basically just does memes all day of Hamilton, and like the cast follows her back and things like that. So it's definitely a show of the internet era. And then I feel like also part of it is that these cast members are so in tune with the public and sort of on social media. I mean, Lin especially. I feel like him most of all, but they're all sort of on social media, some less than others, but they're all as a people connected.
Yeah, because like I wonder if will they do Ham for Ham in like Chicago? You know what I mean? I think because part of that community building, I think, is something like Ham for Ham, right? Where you see them come out of the in civilian clothes and they're interacting with their fans. That's not something you see other musicals or other shows do. Like there's definitely a sense of community around not only the principal actors but the fans as well, and like there's a dialogue between.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I feel like a lot of Ham for Ham shows get chosen because of lots of fan input. Like Lin is always on Twitter looking for ideas, and if he sees a cool one, he'll do it. So people feel like they have more of a say because he's on and he listens, which is also just like I just really love Lin as an artist because he's such a giving artists. Like we didn't have to have the soundtrack that quickly or that well produced. We didn't have shows. We didn't have to have an entire book. We didn't have to have the Hamilton mixtape that is also coming up. I'm very excited for. People want from artists and as fans because he's one himself. So he is like, I'm gonna give it to him. Why not? So it's just really interesting because very few other artists and creators for any medium are like that, you know.
Before we let you go, one of the things I did want to talk about as well. I know that, and we've mentioned it a few times already. Is the Hamilton, which is the annotated libretto, but which also gives like a lot of background and great photos about the production. That dropped a couple weeks ago. I know that you had been super excited to get it. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with the book, having seen the show, having listened to the soundtrack, having been a fan? What can you give us a quick review of the tome and your relation to it?
It's well done in terms of like it maps the story of each song in order, and then what really struck me was the way that it sort of in a parallel manner, it tells the story of how the show came to be. So obviously the first song is Alexander Hamilton, and that was the first song ever performed from the show. So it starts off with that in 2009, but somehow it just like weaves its way through the creation of the show through each song. So it's just like, okay, by the time we get to Nonstop, they're sort of in the middle of the process of creating the show. By the time they get to Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story, they're at opening night and they've, you know, just gotten all their reviews and they're all very excited and happy at the end. So that was really an interesting way to go about it. And then all the individual all the chapters that sort of talk about a song and then maybe one of the principal actors in that song was really nice to see. So sort of like, okay, when are we going to get to a chapter that's about David, or when are we going to do the chapter that's about Leslie? So I really like that aspect of it too, where it's just like, okay, it's about to be Say No to This, we're going to talk about Jasmine. Just little things like that where it's just so well constructed and sort of telling maybe like 3 parallel stories as it weaves its way through the soundtrack. And then it has really, really beautiful photos in it. That was probably one of my favorite parts of like, oh wow, I turned the page and it's just like, whoo, beautiful photography.
When you finally brought it home, did you read it cover to cover in one sitting?
I did not. I just had like work and stuff. So I like got it from the drama bookshop, which Lynn has been like, you know, heavily supporting because they had a recent like water crisis and buying books from actual bookstores, obviously. So I brought it home and I was just like, okay, it's mine. And then I sort of basically read it Act 1 and then Act 2 the next day. But what was really great is that I was reading it on the train and this like Black girl and her mom spotted me across the way on the train and kind of like smiled at me knowingly, and then I like smiled back, and then they're like looking at my book and I was like, and I like gave them a thumbs up like it's really good. So it's just like this weird like way of describing how Hamilton brings people together, just like even strangers on a train. And like I've met a lot of like internet friends because of the show, and it's just like you were talking earlier about how it's like a community. It's sort of like a community with us and the actors and the cast, but also like between each other, it's been, you know, building and building. I just really enjoyed that moment of like, I see you and you see me and we're like, we know that that's the Hamill book.
Well, it's weird too, because like it's gotten to a point where if I drop a Hamilton reference among like company and they don't know what I'm talking about, it's almost like, are you serious?
Right. It's like, what's wrong with you? Have you not listened to it yet? There are a few people where I'm still trying to convince them to listen to it. And I'm like, when you do, you let me know. You live text me, you live tweet me, you let me know.
If you could boil it down to one particular track on the soundtrack or number in the show itself, what is the showstopper for you? What is the one that you always come back to as like, this instills the totality of the Hamilton experience and fandom for me?
Well, that's an impossible question. I have like, it literally always changes. Like I have 2 alarms. One's Nonstop, one's the Schuyler Sisters. So those are definitely 2 like top favorites. But I feel like if I were to choose something that's were to encapsulate how I feel about Hamilton and then like its range would be a run of songs. So I cheat. Yeah. This is how I cheat. So if you go from Guns and Ships to Yorktown, So Guns and Ships, History Has Its Eyes on You, and Yorktown. That sort of encapsulates both I Can't Choose and also the range of like, you know, like sort of straight up hip hop songs, but also R&B, like slower belting tone to it. So it kind of encapsulates both. So that's how I cheat. I always choose, if I had to pick a top 5 like list of songs, Guns and Ships through Yorktown is one song.
I'm actually the same way. Because I know I asked the impossible question because I also have a similar answer. And it's that but for me, it's it's funny. It's always 3 too, but for me, it's Winter's Ball through Satisfied.
Yeah.
It's like one, for me, that's one moment. That's one kind of like one. To me, it's the most genius part of the whole play, that how it's like Rashomon. It tells the same story from different perspectives, which is that you do it on stage. It blows my mind that that's even possible. And then you know, Philippa and Renee being like, they are probably my favorite performers, at least on the soundtrack, again, because I've not seen the play. But so yeah, for me it starts with Winter's Ball, Helpless, Satisfied as like one kind of like moment. And then I would throw Guns and Ships. I'm actually, what I'm doing is I'm echoing my daughter's favorite, because my daughter, her in was the Schuyler Sisters, but now she is totally Lafayette obsessed. Like, you should see this little 9-year-old Asian girl like trying to rap Guns and Ships. It's the best thing. Like,
that's great, because that's what the whole like point is, that like, look, diversity in this kind of media. And I felt really validated about my choices in like the run of 3, because in the Hamilton, the sort of lyric layout was Guns and Ships, History Has Its Eyes on You, and Yorktown all in one. There was no like annotations in the middle, no chapters in the middle. It was sort of one long thing, and I was like, see, I'm not the only one.
Well, you have this intimate connection with the musical. This is why, again, I could not do a Hamilton podcast on Hard NOC Life without having Connie on the show. So this is why you're here. You know, I'm sure you especially could talk about Hamilton for another 7 or 8 hours, but we all have lives to go back to. But
unfortunately,
before I let you go, can you tell our listeners and viewers like some places that they can find you on the web?
You can find me on Twitter at Constar24. I have a sort of blog that needs dusting off at constarrights.tv, and you can see me. I'm the sort of TV editor of Black Girl Nerds, and I write for the Nerds of Color.
We're actually going to have some more guests come on in a few minutes, but before then, we're just going to take a break. So we'll be right back in a minute. We'll get back to the Hamilton talk, but I wanted to first tell you guys about Black Girl Nerds. As you know, Black Girl Nerds is a website, but it's also much more than that. It's one of the best Twitter follows on the internet. It's also a podcast. And the founder, Jamie Broadnax, has just launched a Patreon to help her keep her community growing and sustainable. So if you want to help Black Girl Nerd, check out patreon.com/blackgirlnerds and pledge your support. And we're back on Hard NOC Life. We're still talking about Hamilton, but I have some more guests, some more special guests to talk about our favorite musical that's currently blowing up everything right now. And those guests are founder of the Oscar So White hashtag, as well as a managing editor for Broadway Black. It's none other than April Rain. Welcome to Hard NOC Life, April.
Thank you so much for having me.
And joining April on the show is a reporter for The Hollywood Reporter, who's written about Hamilton, is also an obsessive Hamilton fan. All the way live from Los Angeles, California, please welcome Rebecca Sun.
Thanks so much, Keith. I'm a big fan.
Thank you for being on our little Hamilton podcast. One of the reasons I wanted to talk so much about Hamilton is that, one, they just won the Pulitzer. That's pretty cool, right? And then Rebecca, the reason I wanted you on the show is that you've been talking about how Hamilton's been handling their financial situation. And I thought that's a relevant topic because one of the arguments against casting people of color in Hollywood is that people of color don't bring in money. And I think Broadway has a history of marginalizing people of color. So how has Hamilton kind of changed that calculus, as it were, for lack of a better word?
Sure. I mean, I think that Hamilton has changed the game. It's not just the story of the fact that it's created by and starring people of color. It's sort of changed the game for Broadway in general. I mean, these are just unprecedented numbers. This success is on a scale that, sort of just trumps everything. I think that it has proven that, like all these other genres of entertainment, the appetite and the audience for stories told by diverse people, starring diverse people, is huge. And so I think it's, and to see that happening in a microcosm like Broadway, something that is traditionally very much consumed by a more elite and more white segment of the population, is enormous.
April, as someone who kind of covers Broadway, what is your take on the Hamilton phenomenon and what it means for audiences of color as well as actors of color on the big white way, as it were?
It's sort of a mixed bag, unfortunately. And Broadway Black had a panel about diversity at the very first Broadway Con in New York in January. And we had, just everyone from the Broadway community represented. So we had a playwright and an actor and someone from backstage and so on. And it's great that Hamilton is breaking all of these records, because it means that when the story is of quality, that people will flock to see it, and then will take out a second mortgage on their home to do so. The thought and the hope there is that it will open up more opportunities for others. At the same time, we have to remember that Broadway, the actual theaters on Broadway, all of them, are owned by just 4 families. And it is true that while Hamilton appears to, on the outside, be making significant strides with respect to inclusion in the theater community, behind the scenes, unfortunately, people of color and those from marginalized communities are still fighting an uphill battle to get more of our stories told.
I think that's actually a really good point, because I believe it was Gene Demby at NPR Code Switch who wrote about, for NPR, being at the show, and he was one of the few people. There were very few people of color in the audience, and that's one of the criticisms, I think, of Broadway in general, is that it doesn't necessarily attract a diverse audience. Hamilton, some of its biggest boosters are white people. So what can be done to help break through that stranglehold of those 4 families and make Broadway more inclusive?
Well, I think it's a step-by-step approach. I mean, and I think Lin-Manuel Miranda recognizes, the demographics of his audience, and so he will be bringing in students from diverse communities to see the show so that they have that experience, and so that is going to change the demographics, and I think it's important that we support shows that are in smaller venues and that may be off-Broadway. I mean, Eclipsed is a fantastic example of that, starring Sekon Sanglo and Lupita Nyong'o, which started off-Broadway, fantastic production, and now it's being transferred to Broadway, and so that gives another opportunity. But I think it's important that we don't just go see the big name shows like Denzel does Broadway every summer, and it's fantastic to see him, and it's always very moving. But let's also support the lesser known actors and actresses and playwrights, so that they get the same opportunities and continue to make that work. Regional theater is important too, and national tours are equally important. And so there's a lot that we can do, and it's true that Hamilton is expensive, but there are ways around that as well. And again, I think Lin-Manuel is attempting to address that by doing the Ham for Ham and the lottery and things of that nature.
Right, and one of the things that I love about the lottery is that I believe if you win the lottery, you only have to pay $10 to get in the show. Is that the deal?
I think that's right. Yeah, for the standing room only tickets.
You get in for Hamilton, and that's the other big news, right? That because of the popularity of this musical, the U.S. Treasury Department has decided against replacing Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill, and they announced that Harriet Tubman would be on the $20 bill, which is also a complicated process that is probably should be the topic of a whole other conversation, but that just shows the power of this. I mean, I think Jack Lew single-handedly credits Lin-Manuel Miranda for not replacing Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, and it makes sense, and I think more people are learning who Hamilton was, and what his importance was to American history. And so, if you have to replace someone, I think it makes sense for Jackson to go. Although the update that I heard this evening is that he's still going to be on the bill, just not on the front. So Harriet
Right.
Tubman on the front and Andrew Jackson on the back, which actually makes it much more problematic for me
Yeah.
personally than it had been just Harriet Tubman. But again, that may be fodder for another show.
Right. No, I mean, yeah, there's a whole lot of complication. And I was seeing people on Twitter saying, "Hey, Andrew Jackson had a musical. Why are we getting rid of him?" And I'm like, just be quiet. But speaking of going back to the topic of Hamilton, Rebecca, the Nerds of Color, as you probably know, musical theater is not usually one of the topics that we cover on the Nerds of Color. But one of the things that I felt like why Hamilton kind of dovetails with a lot of things that we talk about at the Nerds of Color is that there's this idea of race bending. And Rebecca, you and I connected over the whole hashtag AA Iron Fist a few months ago, in which we at the Nerds of Color were campaigning for an Asian American actor to play this superhero who's traditionally Caucasian but has all of the trappings of like Orientalist fantasy. And there was, you were a victim of many of the fist bros on Twitter probably saying, like, you don't know what you're talking about. Hamilton is an example of taking canonically, I mean, this is not even canonic, historically white people, recasting them with people of color, and still resonating with audiences, still getting at the essence and the truth of who these people are. As April said, people are learning about who Alexander Hamilton is because of the musical. What is your thoughts about that kind of like the race bending aspect of Hamilton, and how that kind of speaks to why it's okay in other genres to maybe not have whiteness at the center of everything?
Sure. I mean, I think that one thing with race bending, and I definitely saw this a lot, is a very common rebuttal is, people always give examples of like, well, what about Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, or what about when Michael B. Jordan played the Human Torch? Race bending, just in the same way that, the phrase reverse racism is kind of a fallacy, so is reverse race bending. I recently came across this great Tumblr post that was actually written like 2 years ago, from a Tumblr that is Time Machine. Yeah, I wish I knew the name of this person to properly attribute them. But, I'll link to it in my Twitter again. But basically, if you think of canonically white characters and characters of color as these two bowls, right, of like raisins or whatever you want it to be, the number of white characters in the canon is just overflowing, whether you're talking about from like original fictional source material, going from like Danny Rand as Iron Fist to Sherlock Holmes or anything like that, to people who are based on sort of these known historical figures, because American history tends to be dominated by white, the history of white people. That's an overflowing bowl, and there are like, compared to like the dozens of characters of color that there are. And so when you race bend a white character into a character of color, you're literally you're taking away a drop in that bucket. It's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that percentage. Whereas when you're race bending, a character who is canonically a person of color, and then making them and whitewashing them, that's like 5% of the characters of color that you have. And so why Hamilton really resonates and sort of busts the genre is because, like April said, musical theater is classically extremely white, especially, compared to like other genres like film and television and things like that. And so it's extremely different and fresh when you see a race-bent show like Hamilton, and you add that on top of sort of the musical genre, like literally the type of music and that show represent, or that show is employing, and you're bringing in a whole new audience. I think that Gene Demby's article is extremely important in noting that, like you guys said, the audiences, like the in-theater audiences of Hamilton, have not changed that much, because again, Broadway audiences tend to be super white because they tend to be super rich. But the fact that Hamilton has all of these fans who've never been able to be inside the Richard Rodgers Theater, whether that's by dint of geography or economy, the fact that soundtrack has traveled the way that it has. A lot of it because of social media, because of the way in which communities of color engage with social media. You know, I think that really speaks to, again, the power of the fact that this show has transcended the genres in so many different ways, if that makes sense.
You know, and the raisin metaphor is apt, because I think I've linked to that Tumblr many times too. And your former colleague Mark Bernard, in a recent article for the LA Times, actually he did a variation with like action figures, but it was the same kind of concept. Like if you have children and you have one child who has 100 white action figures and another child who has like 2 brown action figures. If you take away one of the white action figures, they're not going to notice. But if you take away like one of the only brown action figures, and now they only have one left, it's kind of important that you don't do that. And that's kind of what the Doctor Strange, Ghost in the Shell, all of these in a row over the last couple weeks of just like Asian characters being erased from existence and being replaced by white people has elicited such outrage from our community in particular, because, like you said, there aren't a lot of Asian people in pop culture to begin with, and you start erasing them. Of course, we're going to be upset about that. But it's also interesting with the race bending in Hamilton, because it's not just the canon, it's actual history that they've race bent. Some of the backlash that the show has gotten from historians, from other people of color, has been the fact that we are kind of whitewashing, even though these actors are people of color all the way through. We're still kind of whitewashing history in the sense. April, have you heard some of the backlash how Hamilton has, because it's focusing on these founding fathers, it kind of lionizes, let's say, like George Washington, who was a slave owner, and having like black people play these founding fathers is a bit problematic. Have you heard some of that criticism?
I have not, and I am thankful for it. I don't get it. I mean, I think that we are reclaiming history in a sense. I mean, really the whole point, I can't speak for Lin-Manuel, who is a genius on several different levels, but,
certified.
Right. I think, at least for me, one of the fantastic things about Hamilton is that it is opening up the story of American history to people who would not otherwise be interested in it. And that would probably include a lot of young people, and I'm talking millennials and younger, so, high school students as well. And that would include people of color. So, initially, if you say to me, you're going to hear about Hamilton and Aaron Burr and so on, I'm not interested in that. I know there was a duel and somebody died in Hamilton. I may have known that Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, if you tell me that I'm going to be able to see a stage full of people of color, freestyling and rapping to music produced by the Roots, then you've piqued my interest. And it's sort of I liken it to Schoolhouse Rock. You don't even realize you're learning American history because you're having fun and you're singing along. I think there will always be critics of everything, and some of them you just have to put to the wayside because to me, they're just looking for a reason to attempt to end what I think is fantastic.
Yeah, I did read the art there. I read about that criticism in I think it was a Slate article that had an interview with this historian who is the sort of the Hamilton the musical detractor, and it was definitely a bummer to read as sort of a Hamilton stan, but I read it, and I think her argument is that even though these are actors of color, there's no historical characters of color being portrayed. Like if you're just talking about just the historical figures, they were all white, and I get that argument, but I'm sort of I am in agreement with April in the sense that these are the facts, right? This is the story, and George Washington was the first president of this country, and he was white. How do you reclaim those facts? And I think that what Lin-Manuel Miranda has done is he has thematically connected it to what's going on now with, as he calls it, the hip-hop generation or the sort of the immigrant generation. And so I think arguments like that are sort of a bummer because there is room at the table, in my opinion, for all of the stories. Like, I don't think that Hamilton's existence negates the ability for somebody else to write, a show based on that era told exclusively from the perspective of the people of color who lived through that time. Do you know what I mean? But and I think that Hamilton creates a space. It sort of opens the door for things like that to happen. A show like that, this hypothetical show that we're talking about that features historical characters of color, maybe it's easier for that show to be developed, and to go up through the public theater or the sort of regional theater circuit because of the success that Hamilton has demonstrated. I think it's just a bummer to sort of pile on Hamilton and see it as a bad thing just because it can't encompass all things.
Right, and who would these people of color be, right? Because at this point, I mean, they would be enslaved people. So is he advocating for having, sort of a tangent where the enslaved are requesting their freedom? I don't know. I mean, we're talking about, Hamilton was born in the mid 18th century. So, slavery was alive and kicking during that time. And I'm not sure how that would even rightfully fit into the story, that Lin-Manuel Miranda is trying to tell.
And I also think, I think there's something very subversive about the fact that in Hamilton you have characters who were like slave owners, right? Like Thomas Jefferson, and most of them pretty much being played by the descendants.
But I think there is this subtextual thing about seeing, so there's a line in the play where Lafayette and Hamilton say, "Immigrants, we get the job done," and of course, in the context of the 1700s, the immigrants were French, and I guess he's Scottish by way of the Caribbean, but seeing two people of color say "immigrants, we get the job done" in the environment that we live in, where Trump is running for president, calling for the deportation of all immigrants, and this kind of hatred and divisive language about immigration. I think there is this subtext by having the people of today tell the stories of the people of yesterday that's powerful. Again, seeing people of color reclaim these stories and making it reminds me of, again, going back to tying into what we do at the Nerds of Color. It reminds me of the criticism of that by race bending essentially white characters, they're taking away from potentially stories of actual people of color. Reminds me of a lot of criticism that we get when we do advocate for, say, an Asian American Peter Parker or an African American Human Torch, that they say, why do you want to take these white characters when you could be boosting or creating new people of color to be characters? Why why are you just borrowing some guy's mask instead of making up your own? And it's on one hand, it's about kind of just reclaiming these stories for ourselves because these stories already exist. And the second thing is about opportunity. And from a casting perspective, the fact that it opens opportunity for actors of color who may not have those opportunities on the stage or on screen to take the roles of characters that are traditionally white, I don't think hurts anybody. And this leads me to the next topic, that one of the things that people got salty about with Hamilton is that when the casting call went out for the touring company, there was a civil rights lawyer and a few papers that made a big stink about the fact that they called for non-white actors to audition. April, as someone again who monitors Broadway, what was your first opinion when you saw that there was a, let's say, disagreement about the casting call for Hamilton?
Right. Well, as someone who practiced law for 20 years, the red flag immediately went up. And so, I understand what the argument is. And so I think, the casting agents and directors had to be very careful with the wording. But this happens all of the time, specifically asking for or requesting blonde-haired women or white people to play certain roles, and I think Hamilton wasn't intentionally thumbing their nose at that, but just attempting to stay true to Lin-Manuel's vision, and continue where he started. It's my understanding that there will eventually be a woman playing Alexander Hamilton, so there'll be some gender bending as well. I think what they'll end up doing is the same thing that they've done with white actors and actresses for decades. You bring everybody in and you test them out, and it just so happens that the best qualified actor or actress for a particular role is a person of color. And so if you don't specifically, if you word it properly, then you won't have those issues because everyone will have the opportunity, and that's what Oscar So White is about as well, equal opportunity so that everyone gets a shot, and then you choose the best person for the job or for the role.
Yeah, I think that the thing with that casting notice controversy is, I think there was a different way to word it that wouldn't have invited the pushback. But again, it's baked into the premise of Hamilton is the fact that I think that the race bending is a essential as a core feature of the show, and a big reason of why it works and why it resonates on that sort of metatextual level that both of you guys have talked about. It's also not a new thing for shows for art, to specify race in casting, and like last year there was a play called The Mountaintop. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but
yes,
right, it's about Martin Luther King, and there was a local, like a college production that they wanted to do something sort of daring and experimental, where they dual cast the role of Martin Luther King, with a black actor and then with a white actor, and the playwright found out about it and said that was definitely not okay, and it has now added a clause into the licensing agreement of her play to say that, unless she approves it, this role is to be played by a black actor, and that's her prerogative. The creator of anything, has the right to do that if you, as people have done for as long as art has been around. It usually just goes unremarked when you're specifying Caucasian in the roles. People try to do this with Asian, like the very, very few musicals starring like Asian characters, where like some regional theater in Ohio will be like, oh, sorry, we yellow-faced everybody, we just don't have Asian actors in Ohio, and
but that was even like Miss Saigon on Broadway, like it was when Jonathan Pryce was cast as an Asian person. Like it doesn't even extend beyond, it actually happens on Broadway as well all the time.
Yeah, in New York.
And then there are no Asian actors in New York. Well, but talking about like the specifying race, one of the things about, again, going back to Iron Fist, one of the reasons that I started the Iron Fist thing way back in 2014, but then the momentum started again back in December, because I was hearing from actors who wanted to try out for the role that their casting agents were telling them, you need not apply because they're not looking at Asian actors. And I think is when you guys did some reporting about that getting out, and then maybe Marvel was meeting with Asians just to kind of save face. But people were telling me like, no, they may be saying that, but we're getting on the DL, like, don't bother bringing so and so in because we're not looking at that, right? So it's like, because whiteness is the default in most cases, especially in Hollywood. This is why April started the Oscar So White campaign, especially on Broadway. Whiteness is the default. When it comes to casting, I don't understand why it's a big deal to make non-whiteness a default, once in a while.
No, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the rebuttals that I got when I wrote that Iron Fist editorial for The Hollywood Reporter were things like, well, the character is canonically white. If you want a Asian superhero, you should make your own. But the problem is, I can't jump into a time machine and go back to the 1960s when, these comics were originally being created. I think that you have to acknowledge that there's an inequity of representation, baked into the system. And so, with Iron Fist, that specific instance, that is a character that is steeped in Asian culture, in Asian mysticism. And so we're not randomly asking for a character to be race-bent Asian. We didn't cherry pick, give us that superhero. No, we're saying that this is one that already traded on a racialist trope, and here's an opportunity to correct the sort of systemic inequity that existed back when that character existed, or was created, was conceived.
Even if you do
create your own, they will still take it from you and westernize it, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so that argument holds absolutely no water. When you do attempt to make your own, they will still come and misappropriate it and change it into what they want it to be. So where does one go? If you can't work within the system because they're not hiring you, and then you can't step out of the system and make your own, and then they come in and remake your stuff. I mean, there's also a difference between, historical figures and characters that are completely made up. How can you argue about a comic book character like Spider-Man? He really could be anyone you want him to be and look any way you want him to be. Or something like when Michael B. Jordan, played the Flash.
Human Torch.
Human Torch.
The Human Torch. Thank you. Who's to say what he can't be? Once you get into actual people who lived and walked on this earth, then the conversation becomes more interesting. But, that just goes back to Hamilton and the mountaintop. And the tumbler with the raisins, so why would you take yet one more piece of fruit from already marginalized community and make it even worse?
Yeah, and race bending Alexander Hamilton is super different from race bending Martin Luther King, and that's just one of those things where, like, if you don't get it, I don't know how to explain that.
Well, and the other thing is that people always go back to the whole money issue, and this is again why I wanted you on, Rebecca, because you've talked about the just the phenomenal financial success that Hamilton has created. The reason I bring that up is that, going back to the whitewashing Scarlett Johansson stuff, everyone's favorite director, Max Landis, was on Twitter and YouTube talking about how we don't know how the industry works. We're getting mad at the wrong people. I know that April engaged him in a debate on Twitter. It's a series of tweets that I labeled "Screenwriter Refuted," by the way. It's another Hamilton reference. April, some of the things that you were telling, like he was trying to say is that, like, Hollywood is dependent on stars, and there are no stars that can open movies the way Scarlett Johansson can. Yada yada yada. Basically, we don't give people the opportunity to star in these films, to build that clout, and then there are no stars to be put in these movies. Therefore, we can only put white people. Is that the gist of what he was saying?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, he was rambling for so long, and he is just steeped in white, rich male privilege and doesn't even see it. So he wanted to be condescending and explain to us how Hollywood works, but then in the same breath or the same tweet say that Hollywood is broken so that it doesn't work. Well, you have to pick one, Max. Either this is how it works, but it doesn't work because it's broken. And there are so many examples. I mean, his argument is that there are two black male actors who can open a film, Will Smith and Denzel Washington. And then, an hour before that, he says Idris Elba is a god and he should be treated as such, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And then he says, Bradley Cooper is going to be in my next film, and Idris was my second choice. Well, if Idris is a god, why would you not choose Idris for that role and prove the broken Hollywood system as you see it wrong by allowing him to open that film? If you look at Straight Outta Compton, it had no name, well-known actors, and yet it grossed $200 million worldwide and counting. And that's, it wasn't just black people that went to see the film. I keep saying over and over again, whether it's film or TV or stage, if the story is good, people will come see it. Meanwhile, we have Star Wars, The Force Awakens. I think it's at $2 billion worldwide now, with 3 relatively unknowns in John Boyega, the female lead, and thank you, and Oscar Isaac. Now, so you have a woman, a Latino, and a black man leading a $2 billion film. So you can't say, and that's only $10 or $15 a pop as opposed to $150 for Hamilton. So you can't say that we as marginalized communities cannot fill seats. We can. And if anyone has the opportunity to prove all of that wrong or to fail spectacularly in attempting to do so, It is the son of John Landis, who has never had to, to struggle a day in his life, but who has the name, who has the platform, who has the money to be able to get this done.
I'd also love how people conveniently forget that like the Fast and the Furious movies have grossed like $4 billion.
Right.
There's
and
like
look
two
how
white people in all of them.
Yes.
You know what's funny too is that like they just cast Scott Eastwood in like Fast and Furious 8 to replace Paul Walker. And I don't know. I mean, did you need it? Was The Rock not enough?
Yeah.
Right, you needed the white guy because, you've got Vin Diesel and you've got Tyrese and you've got The Rock, but there's no white person and you got to have a white person in the film or it doesn't work.
We'll wrap it up on this. Again, I think it's safe to say we're all big Hamilton obsessives. So before we go out, how did you guys come to this particular show? Or I guess, again, for us, it's a relation to the soundtrack and not the show. So we'll start with you, April. I guess you cover Broadway, so you were probably in on it before everybody else was, right?
I'd like to think so. And we've been talking about Hamilton long before it opened, just because it sounded like it was going to be such a transformative work. And, Lin-Manuel Miranda had huge success with In the Heights. And so, I will be ensuring that I'm following whatever he does, wherever he does it. And Hamilton started out, as a reading at the White House.
Right.
And he completely flipped the script. And now, something that we didn't touch on, the actors in Hamilton are now going to be able to start sharing the profits of the musical. That's huge. That is, and it may just change the industry, so it's like actors in film who, get a piece of the back end as opposed to getting their money up front. And what it means is that these actors in Hamilton, all of whom are brilliant, the original actors will have more stability because they'll have more money to take more risk, do other works, do smaller pieces, bring other people along to increase the amount of inclusion on the stage. So Lin-Manuel is, hopefully setting up at least the next 10 or 15 years for additional works like his.
Rebecca, real quick, what was how did you come to the show and what was that experience like when you first listened through of the soundtrack?
Well, so I was a fan of Lin-Manuel Miranda since In the Heights. That was when I was still living in New York, and so I saw that. I saw In the Heights on Broadway and totally loved it, and I think that he's part of it is just his genius, kind of like what April said. I would go see anything he makes, I would listen to anything he writes. I also have this predilection for I love things that sort of are genre busters. And so Hamilton sort of did that on every level. I mean, I did see that Andrew Jackson musical, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, that was also started at the Public, and I loved that, honestly. I mean, and that musical, I will say, did acknowledge his genocidal tendencies. It was a genre buster, so it was so great, and I think that what I loved about Hamilton was on so many levels, metatextually and just the subversive way, and it was in which it was using people of color to tell the story of a sort of white American history. The music is they're just purely jams, and they're so rich, both in terms of American colonial history as well as just hip hop history. I like to listen to the soundtrack while I'm reading Genius.com so that I can nerdily pick through all the references. There's a lot that connects.
You have to get this too, Rebecca.
Oh my gosh, I have to get the Hamilton tone. So many ways in which they can take my money, which deservedly so. And it just connects in many ways, like Satisfied. That's my favorite track, and I think there's something about the way that Lin-Manuel Miranda was able to tap into that tortured psyche of the woman, How can you not? I guess is what I'm saying,
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a great show. I hope you all get a chance to see it on Broadway or when it tours. I want to thank my guest, Rebecca Sun, can be found at The Hollywood Reporter and on Twitter at The Rebecca Sun.
That's me.
And you can find April Rain also on Twitter at Reign of April. She's also the managing editor of Broadway Black, as well as an editor at New Tribe magazine.
Correct. Thank you again for having me.
And thank you for watching and listening to Hard NOC Life. I am your obedient servant, K. Chow. See you next time.
your screen, hit play, so check this. This is the hard knock life, but not the chica kind. More like the people in the world seeking perspectives with a different line. The kids who share the interest together with a similar kind. When they said Don Glover for Spider-Man, they didn't mind. The activists, directors, comments and the lectures, fanboys, professional artists and professors. Maybe a nerd who's just like you, talking about the things that you like too. So I invite you to the NOC. In full color, you see me, the Hard Knock